Hello everyone, Nathaniel Gavronsky, and I am in Kinderhook, New York, which is a few miles south of Albany, and I want to talk to you about the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren. So Martin Van Buren is born on December 5th, 1782. He is the descendant of Dutch parents. He becomes known as the Red Fox of Kinderhook because he has fiery red hair, and he speaks Dutch primarily at home. He's also the first president of the United States to be born a U.S. citizen. His politics were formated during his early years. His dad ran a tavern here in Kinderhook, and it was a common location for people traveling between Albany and New York City. And so, like Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton would frequent that tavern. So he learned a lot about political discussion and debate from the people who would come in. So he was always discussing, listening to politics. He became an apprentice law student at the age of 14 and tried his first case at 15 and won. He was a very, very successful political organizer. He's the very first professional politician. When we think of politicians today, he's just a professional politician. Van Buren was the first one. Everyone else kind of got into politics because it was economically important for them to do so, because their livelihoods depended on it for their farms or their businesses or their wherever it was. Martin Van Buren was the first one who started off as an organizer, and so he would start off in the Albany area, the capital region of New York, and he would organize a political machine that would become known as the Albany Regency. Now, his politics were very closely in line with that of Thomas Jefferson. The government that governs the least governs the best, except for Jefferson had a tendency to expand the country without consulting Congress with the Louisiana Purchase. And he also supported Andrew Jackson, who would tell South Carolina that, well, you kind of have to do what I tell you to, because I'm the president and federal powers are going to trump your little state power, with the notification on tariffs with South Carolina. But these were the men that Van Buren seemed to really aspire and want to be like. So as he organized his party, the Albany Regency up here in upstate New York, he became much closely aligned with Jackson and would help be one of the Jackson's Democratic Party founders, actually. And the Albany Regency would kind of take control over the Democratic conventions and decide kind of who got to do what, and cabinet members, and advocating for certain people to be nominations and stuff like that. So Van Buren was the guy who organized kind of how the political machinery of the Democratic Party and eventually the modern-day Republican Party. Van Buren was the architect of that system. So Martin Van Buren, because of his organization skills, he gets elected to the New York State Senate in 1812. He is very, very successful at this role. He comes in by 1821. He is put into the Attorney General's office for the state of New York, and then they elect him. The state legislature elects him to the U.S. Senate. In the U.S. Senate, he actually starts working to help and promote Andrew Jackson's policies. Jackson ran in 24. He lost. He ran again in 28. And in that same election, Van Buren comes up and he becomes the governor of New York. But shortly thereafterwards, because he wanted to come up and help Jackson get more points and more votes up in New York, so he comes to New York to become the governor to do so. And then Martin Van Buren gets tapped by Jackson to join Jackson's cabinet. So Van Buren retires. He resigns from the governor of New York to come back to Washington to serve in Jackson's cabinet. And this is where his political abilities aid Jackson in a couple of scandals. One of the biggest ones happens to be with the fact that Jackson and his vice president Calhoun have a big falling out over the nullification of the tariffs that the federal government passed. And South Carolina said, well, we're not doing it. We don't like this. And Calhoun, being from South Carolina, and Jackson, claiming that he was from there, but we believe he's actually born in North Carolina, they butted heads. They had a big falling out over the idea of state rights versus federal power from the Democratic Party that claimed to be for states' rights and not such a strong federal government hand. So the interesting aspect of this is what I believe, but I'm in charge, so we're doing it this way type of deal with Jackson. Van Buren got caught up in this because Calhoun was a big rival of Van Buren, because Van Buren was on the better side of of Jackson than Calhoun was over this. And there's also what they call the Petticoat Affair. Now, the Petticoat is all the wives of all the cabinets. They didn't get along so well, especially with Jackson's wife. See, Jackson's wife was actually married to someone else when Jackson met her and married her and ran off with her. So there's a little bit of controversy there, but Van Buren always sided with Jackson on these things, and to get rid of Calhoun and some of the troublemakers in the cabinet, Van Buren said, "Let me resign. Let me bring one more guy with me. We'll resign, so we'll put pressure on Calhoun, so they got to resign too, and you can reorganize your whole cabinet, start from scratch." And so Jackson's like, "You know what? Okay." So Van Buren gets appointed to be the minister to England, but Calhoun, who is still the sitting vice president, does a tie-breaking vote for the confirmation of Van Buren's appointment and votes in the negative, and strands Van Buren in London because he arrives there thinking, well, of course I'm going to win. We have the trifecta. Anyway, that gets lost, and he gets sent back to the United States, and he kind of bides his time. But when it comes time for Jackson's second presidential election, he brings Van Buren in as a vice president, and Calhoun gets the boot. He gets sent back to South Carolina. So Van Buren joins with Jackson, and they actually win the following election with a much higher percentage than Jackson did the first time. And so Jackson's kind of on a roll. The Jackson Democrats are really just kind of running with things. In fact, this would be the most successful party in American history as far as electing presidents. Boom, 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 boom. They would win more elections than they would lose. They would lose some, but they basically held on to power for several decades. Now, Van Buren, for all of his political wit, he is the first president. Again, he was first president to be born a U.S. citizen. He was also the first and only Dutch president. He was also the first president who could actually and truthfully claim that all of his problems were actually the predecessor, the previous guy's fault. He would never do that because he's such a fan of Jackson. But in all honesty, most of Van Buren's problems were because of Jackson's policies. A couple of Jackson's policies that sunk Van Buren was, one, the removal and the dechartering of the Second National Bank of the United States. This put all the money of the U.S. Treasury into pet banks, or like little state banks, and these banks just lent money to anyone coming crawling. So anyone who lived through the 2008 crisis, kind of the same ordeal. All right, so that's what we're dealing with. Also, Jackson said, if you're going to buy land, you got to buy it with gold and silver. The paper currency is not a thing. You can't do it. And so land speculation drops. The values of land dropped. The revenue dropped. The banks kind of ran out of hard currency because everyone needed it to do everything, and you start getting a run on the banks. So this was the crisis of 1837. Again, all this was mostly kind of Jackson's fault. Van Buren, being the government that governs the least, governs the best type of approach, like a lot of presidents would try to do in the future, it seemed to be so, he doesn't care. Van Buren said, well, this is not my position. I don't have any control. This is not my fault. These are the bankers. The bankers caused this. And it's not the role of the American citizens or the federal government to bail out bad banks for doing bad banking practices. Something that we still talk about today. This is one of Van Buren's legacies. The political machine he created, the way he tried to run the administration. A lot of presidents still try to do that today. Some are more successful. Others are not so much. But a lot of this is all Van Buren's legacy. His legacy way outweighs his time in office. But he really isn't able to overcome the 1837 financial crisis, the banking crisis. Tons and tons of banks close. People lose their livelihoods, their entire life savings. He is known as Martin Van Ruin during this time period. Also, you look at the Speaker of the House, which is James K. Polk, who is another big follower of Jackson, sees the writing on the wall and says, hey, Jack, we're losing Tennessee. Like, Tennessee is a Whig state now. I gotta leave Congress, and I gotta go back to Tennessee. I'm gonna run for governor, try to flip the state back to a Democrat. So that going into 39, Polk is out, Van Buren is underwater in the polls, and the 1840 election, Benjamin Harrison basically runs away with it. So the campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, they run away with the election in 1840, and when they come in 1841, Harrison only lasts a couple of months before he dies, and then Tyler has to come in as vice president into the presidency, which is very controversial at the time. Today we all look at, well, this is how it's done, but at the time it was very controversial. Now we get into some of the other aspects of what was going on. So Jackson wanted to see the expansion and annexation of Texas. He wasn't able to do it under his presidency. He was also trying to get California, and he sent people to California to start up trouble to try to bring California, and it was now Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, to try to bring all of them into the United States Union, manifest destiny. This is something he was working on, but really couldn't be to such a heavy hand. Van Buren comes in. He doesn't really act on any of this stuff, nothing really at all. In fact, when it gets into the 1844 election, Jackson is planning on supporting Van Buren for president, and James K. Polk is, I'm going to be on Van Buren's vice president. I'll be his vice president. I'll be on his ticket. Problem is that Van Buren's a Northerner. His family owned slaves when he was young, when his father died. New York outlawed slavery in 1828. So his wing of the party was not so expansionist, because they didn't want to see the expansion of slavery, and an expansion of the Southern Territory was the expansion of slavery by default. States came in two at a time, two free, two slave. One slave, one state, because you got two senators from each state to keep the balance in the Senate. And we still have that balance today. Even after slavery, the reason why you have two Dakotas is we had two states on the western coast that wanted to come in, but we only had one other state that could balance them. So they cut Dakota into two in 1889 to create the two states to equal. So the two states came in at a time, two Republican, two Democrat. That legacy has more to do with the Civil War than you really think. But anyway, going back into, we're going into this, into the 1830s and 1840s. The Civil War is something, it's seen, like it's coming. And Van Buren, being the political guy he is, knows that he needs to try to keep the country together, and he needs to keep the party together. Don't forget, the Albany Regency is all about cohesion with the party, stop the infighting. And so he just says, well, let's just don't do it, because there's too many, the divide between North and South between the party is too much. Jackson is irate over this. The only person to support annexation is James K. Polk. And Tyler, for his credit, on the Whigs, who were definitely not supportive of annexation and the spread of slavery, annexes Texas the last couple of months while he's in office, knowing that Polk is coming in. And so Polk wins the election. Tyler is still in office until March. And he's like, well, I'm just going to do it, because I'm obviously not going to be president. I'm not allowed back in my party. I am just going to take care of this problem and let the cards fall where they lay, where they may. And so Polk comes in. Texas is already on the way of ascending, because Van Buren doesn't get the nomination because Jackson is upset with his op-ed about why annexation is a bad idea. So Van Buren is dumped by his someone he admires so greatly, and someone he believed he wanted to be like so much, because of his stance on annexation. And the convention leading into the Polk becoming the nominee and eventually president, Van Buren was the front runner, but he just couldn't get it because all the notes from Jackson were like Polk, Polk, Polk. And eventually Van Buren's like, I'm throwing my hat in. All my delegates go over to Polk. Polk wins like on the 9th vote. Polk comes in, he wins, does his one term, and then Van Buren tries to come back in. He runs on the Free Soil Party. This is the 1848 election, and he comes in, and he's a Free Soil Party, which was a northern state party, which is a wing of the Democratic Party, just no extension, no expansion. They side with the Whigs on some things, the Democrats on a couple of other things, and it splits the Democratic ticket and allows the Whigs to come in and win the White House, coming in after Polk. And this is kind of the end of that dominating period of the Jacksonian Democrats, and kind of the end of the Jacksonian era. So Van Buren and Polk were kind of the last two guys of that. It would linger on for a little while, but Van Buren stayed involved politically for a little while He was actually asked, because of his anti-slavery views, and being a Democrat, a former Democrat in the North, he was a Democratic machine. The Republican Party asked him if he would come and help them with their convention, and his Albany Regency, his loyalty to the party was so great that he couldn't do it, even though he didn't really believe in the Democratic positions anymore. Don't forget, he supported George Clinton, not because they liked each other, because they very much didn't, but because Clinton was on the same political party, the same ticket. And so Van Buren just couldn't, go against his party, the one that he actually helped form. He just wouldn't do it. And so you kind of go into the Civil War. He's alive. He can see the outcome of some of the things that he was worried about, until you get to July 21st of 1862, and he starts getting really sick. He has a lot of health problems. He's bad asthmatic. He has gout. He has a lot of digestive problems. He becomes comatose. And on July 24th, he passes away during the Civil War. And Kinderhook, who has a lot of admiration for Van Buren, they buried him here in his hometown, and he lays with his wife Hannah. Interesting thing about his wife Hannah, so she died in 1819 from tuberculosis, and Van Buren, when he was retired, wrote a pretty big biography. She gave him 4 children. He doesn't mention her once, not a single time. Hannah is not mentioned in Van Buren's biography, handwritten by him, not even a single word. And so I think that's one of the things I would say is definitely one of his biggest faults, is that he doesn't accredit the woman who gave him his biological legacy and also supported him in his ascension into politics, because wives and spouses, and like husbands and spouses, they are such a huge aspect of this business and this industry, and a lot of times they are an originator of a lot of policy. Don't forget, Abigail Adams was very, hey, you really don't forget about the women, don't forget about the ladies, John. Martha with Washington and Dolly Forge. You look at Dolly Madison with the White House in August of 1814. You see all these aspects where the spouses were so important to the greater legacy of the men that they married. And I believe that would be true with Van Buren as well. He doesn't mention her at all. He is actually the 3rd cousin to Teddy Roosevelt, and so he is actually the very first person in the Roosevelt dynasty for the presidency, even though he doesn't share the Roosevelt name. Actually, they are related. So you would also be able to track him back down to the Garretson family of South Brooklyn. That was actually some of the first organizers and councilmen and mayors of Albany, Rensselaer, Brooklyn, Manhattan. I mean, all these things. There's all original Dutch, and he comes from that family through the generations. So he has a huge New York State pedigree. A lot of people come from this family, like the Roosevelts are related to them, but his legacy is in the political machinery, the political operation, and the activism before his term, even his first political office. That legacy lasts with us today. The term "okay," he was known as Old Kinderhook during his campaign slogans. And so when you say "I'm okay," it means I'm for Old Kinderhook, and it means I am for Martin Van Buren. So the word "okay," Old Kinderhook, okay, that's where it comes. That's literally where the word comes from. So whenever we say "okay," it's actually one of the most recognized words in the world. Comes from the 1830s with Van Buren. So thank you for everyone for watching this video. Stay healthy, stay wealthy, stay wise, and as always, stay wise, America.